Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome back to the Learning to Die podcast. There's our great logo there. We're still on the topic of Musashi, this mental swordsman who was around there a few hundred years ago, old Miyamoto. He hasn't gone anywhere since we last spoke, Kieran, which is good. But before, Kieran, we kick off today's episode, I just wanted to read out a small passage to you about what we're going to speak about today. Because today we're going to focus on the water scroll. And I found this nice passage on the interwebs that I thought might be a good precursor. So you ready to receive the knowledge?
Ready and willing, man. Let's see what happens.
Ready and willing. Water scroll. Water conforms to the shape of a vessel. It can be a drop. It can be an ocean. Because of the purity of water, I write about my individual school in this scroll. The water scroll contains specific sword fighting tactics. Here we get into the classic Zen-like aphorisms, which to Western ears sounds almost comical. The rhythm of the second spring, the flowing water stroke, the body of the short-armed monkey. Many are very specific to sword fighting, such as grips, strokes, stances, etc. But some are more generally applicable. Determine that today you will overcome yourself of the day before. Tomorrow you will win over those of lesser skill, and later you will win over those of greater skill. That's my intro to the book of the Water Scroll.
That last quote there, that last bit, is one of my favorite lines in the whole Book of Five Rings, or favorite sections or quotes or whatever, where it says, my interpretation or my version of it said something along the lines of, I can't remember, I don't have it in front of me now, but it's along the lines of, today's victory over yourself of yesterday, tomorrow is victory over lesser men. Yeah. And I think we might have talked about this in one of the previous episodes, but that concept is so powerful, and it doesn't even matter which way you interpret it. So there's three different ways of coming at that concept. So that the way I just phrased it there was the last couple of lines in what you just read. And there's three different ways of interpreting it for me. One is, every day the priority is to get better at whatever your craft is than you were yesterday. And then eventually you'll beat other people. The second way is every day you get better at whatever your craft is than you were yesterday. And that a secondary outcome that's a bonus is that eventually you might beat other people. The third way, which I got off a musician that I did a podcast with years ago, is he said, and I said this quote to him because we're talking about the honing of the craft and his thing in music and songwriting. And his interpretation is actually my favorite, which was that every day I get better than I was yesterday. And then all the past versions of me are the lesser men.
Oh.
So it's just every day is relentless self-improvement and whatever your craft is.
Yeah.
And that, so it's either I'm all past versions of me or lesser men. Beating other people might eventually happen, and if so, it's a bonus. Or the third one is you have to get better every day so that eventually you can beat other people. But regardless of which interpretation you take on those couple of lines, the focus is on controlling the controllables and relentless self-improvement in whatever your craft is, and forget about the rest of it. It's just relentless self-improvement and honing that skill, honing the craft over and over again every day.
So it's interesting that you say that, because, you know, it's kind of reminiscent of what Jordan Peterson has said, whether you like him or loathe him. He said things about that, compare yourself to who you were yesterday. I'm sure other people have said it as well. The Stoics talk about what's in your control and what's not in your control. And this is interesting and quite timely, Kieran, because last weekend we were doing a grading at our jiu-jitsu club, and a number of people got promoted to black belt. And it's kind of interesting, like, as you go through your journey with any martial art, and the belts are kind of a good way of, you know, notches on the wall, so to speak, of your progress over time or how long you've been at that art, whether it be in jiu-jitsu, karate, whatever it might be. But it's interesting because some people get kind of caught at certain levels and they think, I'm not getting any better. This is shit. I should give up. But I often say to those people, if the person you were on day one walked into the gym, would you kick their ass? And most people go, I don't think so. I'm like, you're a purple belt. Of course you would. No, you just say that. People just say that because that's what mediocre people say. I'm like, it's not. You can see it. And I think the challenge sometimes is the ability for a person to go back and do that it's nearly like a statistical analysis. You're doing like a t-test or an ANOVA back through time over all those versions of yourself, like you were saying, to see if there's any difference. Now, in your head, as a conscious being, trying to do that is very difficult. And you have to rely on the feedback of other people, which can be difficult as well because you think people are blowing smoke up your ass. So sometimes you don't know how far you've come. And are you better than those lesser people that you were before? So I wonder then, Karen, with that in mind, how would we measure how we've improved over time? What would you do for that? How would you improve that? How would you, measure your improvement over time? How would you measure that signal?
See, the thing with martial arts is the difference with something like jiu-jitsu is you have this external viewpoint on your capacity that will come in the form of a belt from an instructor. But then between belts, as you said, or if you're in a martial art that doesn't have a belt, like boxing or Thai boxing, where you can be at it for years and years and someone could be in a brown belt equivalent in boxing or Thai boxing. And you can map equivalents. You can look at characteristics of belts in jiu-jitsu and go a blue belt. They're pretty much trying to fit their, you can map the belt in jiu-jitsu to capacities you'd expect or personality or traits you'd expect the person having that belt to have.
Yeah.
Where like it's a blue belt, they have a kind of if I was to take this, my limited understanding of jiu-jitsu, there's this in a blue belt to be like, there's an understanding of all these different positions enough to be able to have a feel for what's going on in guard, half guard, all these different positions, takedowns, takedown defense. There's a rough understanding. And then purple belt is someone starting to figure out their own game really well.
Yeah.
And then brown belt is they're really dialing in on their own game and they have a much deeper understanding of the principle-based underpinnings of what jiu-jitsu is and how jiu-jitsu works. And then black belt is just kind of, I don't know, a more advanced kind of brown belt that are a brown belt that maybe has done more teaching or a brown belt that has reached a particular level or capacity. But it's like, and then that's probably more open to interpretation. But there's equivalence in something like boxing or Thai boxing. So where to me, it's like, it's so difficult because it's inherently subjective. Because regardless of what fights you take, you could win a lash of fight. You could lose a lot of fights early in boxing and then win a few fights or Thai boxing. But you don't know if actually gotten better because you could have just fought really good fellas early on and fought not so good fellas later on. And your skill level hasn't actually changed or improved. Whereas for me, I kind of take it from a perspective of, or I did take it when I was competing. And even now, as I'm now thinking about jiu-jitsu, I love the concept of paying attention to the space between the obvious bits. So the more awareness I have and the higher the resolution, I can view the spaces between the obvious bits, then the more mastery I feel like I'm acquiring. So in jiu-jitsu or in boxing, the obvious thing is when the fist meets the face or the body or whatever, or a particular combination lands or whatever, or a particular slip happens or roll or pull or whatever. Whereas the space between the obvious bits, and I'm watching a fight, or when I'm thinking about my own participation, it's what's happening between those really obvious events that anyone can see. And it's those little tweaks. Like I know recently you're after getting into baseball, for example. So like the more you're learning about baseball, then the more you're picking up about things that initially when you first got into baseball, you didn't have a notion about. Little tweaks and nuances and technical, strategic things that are taking place that initially it just was all chaos. Or someone who hasn't ever who just watches MMA a little bit with their mates, whatever, having a few beers, but they don't really know what's going on. When they watch two lads rolling around the ground, they have a fucking notion. And then all of a sudden they start to be able to pick out an armbar setup. They start to be able to pick out, oh, that's a triangle choke. Or to be able to start to pick out, oh, he just swept him. And then all of a sudden, what they were watching was the exact same thing, but now they can view it through a higher resolution lens. And then the more we become aware, the more mastery that we develop, the more we pick up within the same frame of time. So then the more awareness we develop of the space between the obvious stuff. That's how I think about it.
So it's interesting, like that you said that, because well, it's interesting about the MMA things. I said that to my dad a few years ago. I said, "Do you ever watch MMA?" "No, I don't watch that shite." He says, "Fellas just going around like gurriers and lunatics in a cage." I'm like, "Man, you have got fucking no idea. Nah, it's only brutes in there, blah, blah, blah. I'd rather watch boxing." And I was like, that's only your ignorance. Like, you got no idea. It's such a technical sport. But that aside, let's elevate this question up above martial arts and let's apply it to everything. So I suppose what I'm kind of digging at here is, as you progress through your life or on a task, how do you measure improvement? Whether it be an academic venture, whether it be a sporting venture, whether it's a martial art, whether you're trying to be more calm in your life and less kind of aggressive, whether you're trying to, I don't know, whatever it might be. What's some of your overarching philosophies or tactics or tools that you might have for improvement? So to probably get the juices flowing on this one, like one of the things I like to do is I like to journal. Now, I'm not saying I journal every single day, but I feel like if I write down stuff or look at stuff, it's good. The other thing I like to do as well, I like to keep lists of things. So at the end of the year, I like to do like a big review. How many papers did I publish? You know, what events did I do? How many things did I swim or run? How much time did I put into jiu-jitsu? Things like that. Big and broad brush strokes. Because then I can think like I'm working towards these certain goals in these different elements of my being. I'm working more like I've got my kind of science, angle. If I'm in the middle of a wheel, I'm pushing on my scientific career. Then within that scientific career, I'm pushing on two parts of that. One is athletic performance and one is more like industrial work. So I'm pushing those two things in that scientific sphere. Then I'm pushing the other one, which is the physical things like swimming, jiu-jitsu, maybe yoga. Did I push enough on those? Did I push too far on one and not on the other? And then the final part of that is more about like, I'll say mental health / relationships, how do I assess those as well? So they're the kind of three big chunks of a circle that I would look at if I was a pie chart of my life and how I'm moving in those. And the goal is to progress with quality, but to be moving it forward. So I'm constantly moving these things forward. The other way you could look at it as well is a bit like Tetris. You're trying to build up the blocks every year to get to the top, right? So you're constantly building up to make these shapes and to get stuff done. So I'm interested in maybe some of your approaches, Kieran, you have there in terms of reflection for improvement.
The reflection is like, I definitely, there's maybe some notes I could take from you or hints I could take from you there on more on the kind of structure and how to even kind of structurally or routinely pay attention to specific components in quantifiable nature, because that's something that I don't do a lot of. But I would journal, but for me, it's more like my kind of go-to kind of philosophy. I came across this quote years ago from this lady, American lady, Maya Angelou. And she said that success is liking who you are, liking what you do, and liking how you're doing it. And I relate that to, can I actually answer those questions?
That's a great, say that again, will you? Success is related to what? So say that again.
Success is liking who you are, liking what you're doing, and liking how you're doing it.
Fuck, that's so simple and yet so effective, isn't it? It's a great kind of, so cool, it's man. Like, it's nearly like putting a calipers to your life. Oh yeah. Yeah. That's within, that's the go or the no go. That's a calipers there. That's awesome.
Yeah. Class. And then I think of it in terms of but then there's that kind of a way of framing, and what that kind of feels like, to use kind of stoic terms, is there's different words in stoicism that relate to states of mind. Like one of them would be like ataraxia, which relates to kind of a state of tranquility, and So there's a kind of a feeling that comes. That's how I kind of describe, if I can legitimately say yes at a moment in time to what Maya Angelou presented there with those three questions or those three statements, then to me, the way to describe that is that kind of, in Stoicism, it might be a state of ataraxia, which would be a kind of a state of tranquility. Or in Zen, it would be a state, to me, that's what I'd use the word Zen to describe. It's a state of Zen where there's an imperturbability. It's like it doesn't really matter what happens in the outside world. It's just dealt with. And it's a place, a state of mind where there's a kind of it's very hard to be wobbled in that place. So if I'm liking who I am, liking what I'm doing and liking how I'm doing it, then whatever happens in the outside world, I've been able to legitimately control the controllables. And then it doesn't matter what happens. It seems like I can't be wobbled. Whereas if my conscience isn't clean, if I know I've been lazy or something, if I know I've procrastinated, if I know there's things I haven't done that I need to do, if I know that I just haven't lived up to my own values, then events in the outside world wobble me much easier. External events are much more likely to rock the boat. So that's how I kind of, and then one last way of kind of looking at it is, because I legitimately find this, I've been writing about this a lot over the last couple of months, and it's been melting me, trying to grapple with the conscience, the human conscience, this Jiminy Cricket, that if we don't pay attention to what it says, it's whatever, it's somehow it's able to keep me awake at night. It's somehow able to affect my ability to relax. It's just this whatever it is, this pattern recognition modeler, whatever it is. I've been grappling with this a lot. And if my conscience is clean, that's an indication that Maya Angelou's questions have been answered favorably, and that I'm also in a state of ataraxic tranquility. And then how that maps onto something like Nietzsche has this concept of eternal recurrence, which is along this line of like, you could almost kind of take that concept by Nietzsche and say, well, how would I live if I knew I needed to do this forever, indefinitely?
Yeah.
And then the counter, not the counter, but another thread to that is, how do I live when I know I must die? So the kind of, it's like I can use both of those things at the same time. It's like, would I live like this if I knew I had to do this forever? And then similarly, eternal recurrence, like this, like that's what Nietzsche was on about. Whereas this, and then on top of that is, how would is this use of my time, how I'm currently living, how I'd like to have lived when I'm in my final moments and I'm about to return my borrowed carbon to nature. So that's how I kind of think about it from like a broad, sweet perspective.
Before I read out the water scroll here, I just wanted to say on that, the other filter, the calipers that I put on my life is when people say, if you won 50 million in the lottery and you didn't have to work again in your life, what would you do? And then my answer is, I keep doing what I'm doing now. And they go, why? I say, because I fucking love it. I love what I do. And people get shocked by that. People are like, what? You wouldn't stop working? I'm like, no. If anything, I'd probably do more, because now I have money to fund more crazy projects. People are like, what? Yeah, no, I would still keep doing it.
More selective, and you could be even more selective of what you take on, because you're not limited by financial constraints.
And I love that. I love the fact that, like, that question, that when it gets asked, or even asking myself, I go, like yesterday, I had a fucking bananas day yesterday, man. I like had this great day yesterday where I just was all over the gaff, like writing papers, scientific papers. We had another paper published. I spoke to an elite athlete in baseball I was working with yesterday. Spoke to like a mining company. Then I had to deal with like some general domestic issue as well, like paying a bill or whatever. And I was just like, how fucking crazy and varied is my day? It's just like, it was awesome. And I was like, every part of it I loved, the variation. I was buzzing. Then we had other conversations this week as well with Greg Bennick. And, I was just like, this is so cool that I have the freedom to do this and I make a living over.
The variation of stimulus is so wicked.
Let's dig into this water scroll here. So at the start of the water scroll, Musashi's talking about basically, he's got this two skies school of martial arts where he's looking at the longsword system. And what's interesting here, I find in the start of this book or this chapter, that he's talking about kind of the science and the feel. But he also talks about, that, if you look at he says that every single word should be given thought in this chapter. And this scares me because I think to myself, no matter how many times I read it, I think, have I missed something here? Like I'm constantly nearly like biting my nails going, fuck, I missed something here, I missed something here. And he says, like, if you think about it in broad outlines, you will get many things wrong. And that's kind of like what you said about a blue belt, or a boxer starting off. They know the generalities or the broad brush strokes or the mechanics. But there's so much stuff you don't know in between. And it's so true, And then he goes on and says that everything like you can do here as well, while it might be applicable to a duel between two people, me and you are sword fighting or boxing or grappling, should also be scalable to an army. And I'm like, man, that's crazy. Like, how do you scale this up to an army? So for me, like, it just talks about when he says here as well, in this way of life in particular, if you misperceive the path even slightly, if you stray from the right way, you fall into evil states, which again is back what you said about doing things with your life and what's right. And for me, I'm like, wow, how do you scale this up to an army level thing, like that thinking? That's something I'm still grappling with.
But I think about from a military perspective, like if we take about an example, like in striking, like in boxing, Muay Thai, whatever, a really, really simple kind of heuristic to think about that is unbelievably rich is a kind of 3 principles of striking that I really like, which is from an attacking perspective is like set it up, get it off, reposition. Set it up, get it off, reposition. So it's like, imagine, so the setup would be whatever it is that I need to do to be able to land the effective strike or combination. That could be a feint. It could be me trying to draw on a certain shot from him that I'm going to then slip and throw a cross down the pipe, or it could be me rolling underneath a hook and coming back at my own hook or whatever. It's like the setup is like a feint, a rhythm change. I'm drawing something from to be able to counter whatever. Then the get off is the shot or the multiple shots that I'm going to throw after I've got my opportunity. Because if we're both standing in front of each other, not doing it, and then we're just feinting and playing around, then we're both trying to actually set something up. So then there's the setup, then there's the get it off. But then once I have the shots thrown, I'm not going to want to be standing there waiting in the same place, because I'm not being defensively responsible and he could just come back with something. So then I either change the distance by going all the way in on top of him, if it's MMA especially, or Muay Thai could be to initiate a clinch or a takedown, or I'm backing away, but backing away, there's pros and cons depending on the situation, or it could be to take an angle off to a side so that I'm not where I was when I threw the shots. So then that sets me up for defensive responsibility and or allows me different targets to hit him now, because I've now taken an angle on him maybe and got to his side a bit. So then I can go again now. I can set it up, get it off reposition. So you see really good fighters like a Floyd Mayweather or Lomachenko in boxing. This is what they did as well, masterfully.
Yeah, I think
how that applies to large scale warfare. You're the one who was in the army, but you could take the same. Potentially, the way I think about it is saying, crack, set it up, get it off, reposition. It's like set it up is, are we going to sneak up on him? Are we flanking him? Are we creating a distraction somewhere else? Attack. But then after we attack, it's like Jocko would say, like cover and move. Is that we don't want to be in the same spot, because then we can get fucking martyred or something. We want to be constantly moving. So we're changing the angle of attack, changing the point of attack. So it's set it up, get it off, reposition. And it's the same principle, whether it be in actual modern warfare or in a boxing ring. So what would you think about that? Because you're the one who was actually in the army.
Yeah, I'm just actually, it's been a long time since I've gone out of the army for 20 years. Before I talk about the military example, I just want to talk about a grappling example, and then we'll come back to a military one, because you might hear in grappling people talk, especially in jiu-jitsu, people talk about position before submission. You may have heard that one. But I have 2 other ones I use as well. And it's in between those 2, right? Because I talk about position, then unbalancing, then deception, and then submission. So that's my whole game is about that. Like I'm a deceptive jiu-jitsu player. I generally won't get you what you think I'm going to get you with. I generally like to play games. I'm deceptive, I'm sneaky, I'm sly. And some people will say that's a test, that maybe that's your character. Maybe it is. I don't know. But I don't live my life like that. But I don't want to use the reason I developed that system is, Karen, because I'm not as physically strong as other people. Generally, people are bigger and generally people are younger and got more energy. But also as well, I'm fascinated by the efficiencies of martial arts, like with sword or like with a gun or like whatever. How can I do the least amount of effort to get the highest amount of reward? So position, unbalancing, deception, then submission. In the military, we have what's called battle drills, and I just looked them up here because I'm not going to pretend like I remember them all exactly. But we used to have these what's called battle drills, battle orders. People talk about them. So you have section 1 is battle preparation. This will be check camouflage, check weapons, check ammunition, receive orders. This is all the prep, right? Getting ready. And there's a few little kind of revision headers here as well. They call them ground, situation, mission, execution, service support, command and signals. And we used to have little books like that when I was in the army. So I was a non-commissioned officer, like a corporal. So we'd have these little things. Then we go into section 2. So the next battle drill, which would be reaction to effective enemy fire. So the minute you come under attack, what are you going to do? And there's some things here that you call dash, get down and crawl, observe, sight the enemy, fire or engage with the enemy, right? So you want to keep behind cover. Then once you've assessed that whole thing that's going on, you work out the location of the enemy. So it's observation, fire and move. So fire, move, fire, move. So you're constantly firing and you might be covering each other as you're doing this as well. So you might fire 2 shots, Karen, as I'm running through. I'll get down, I'll fire 2 or 3 shots and you'll move through as well. And we'll be moving at zigzagging angles constantly as well. We won't be just running in straight lines. So if you're ever watching a movie and you see guys running like in a zigzag thing, that's to put people off trying to sight them on a rifle. It's not that they're running around like a fucking idiot. It's they're just doing that, basically because it's very hard to track somebody. Shooting a moving target is extremely difficult, especially when they're moving lateral. It's harder, and like what you see in the movies is all bullshit. Section 4 is winning the firefight. So here's when you talk about things like the group, the range of the fire, indication, type of fire. So you might shout out like 2 to 3 rounds rapid fire after if you've sighted. So everybody might be lying in a hedgerow and you might say like the target is red truck, 5 enemy at the base of the large sycamore tree. Fire at will, bursts of 2 to 3 shots. And everybody repeat that and fire. So it's group, range, indication, type of fire, clear and loud as an order with pauses as well. So you want to make sure it's getting through. And then obviously if you say cease fire or stop fire, everybody will stop. And then you might move into the attack. So before you go into the attack, you might give like a little mini orders. Like 4 or 5 of us out of a section might go, right, the enemy's there, and you launch a little small group out of that section or platoon, and they might flank the enemy. So they might go around to the side. It might be a direct assault, or you might have 2 or 3 guys pretending they're going up the middle for an assault, but it's the guys coming in on a flank that might actually really be attacking the enemy. So these guys be just putting down suppressing fire. Okay, so you'll have that happen as well. So you break people into like what's called fire teams or defensive teams. That will happen. You'll finish that, and then you go into the last one, which is called reorg and redeploy. So this is basically like you've annihilated the target, you've killed the target, you'll form a circle around there as well. The NCO and, or the leader will be in the middle. They'll check to make sure everybody's okay first and foremost. We'll do kind of a body count. We'll check ammunition. We'll check water. And basically we'll make the area safe. We'll make sure there's no explosives, whatever it might be. And then we'll get up and we'll go on our next axis of advance to our next target, or we might hold out there as a defensive position. So they're what we call like battle drills or reorg. So I think reversing them back down, there's a lot of similarities then when we're fighting one-on-one or vice versa, because you do want to kind of get ready, observe the enemy, maybe wait for the attack, or you go on the offensive, you win that firefight, or you win that fight, as you say, like punching or in a round could be seen as a firefight. And then, you reorg at the end of the round and you redeploy. So I think there's lots of parallels both ways. And it's interesting because I never really kind of thought of that until I started talking to you today. So this is the benefits of of this discourse.
I think when it works, I think that same concept kind of works at a fractal level in a micro and a macro way within that firefight, because even that, if you just took that kind of cover and move concept by itself, that cover and move concept would be the example of set it up, get it off, reposition, because we're constantly the repositioning aspect is obvious. So that would be like the micro example, or the fire team moving up the middle to distract, to set up the flanking fire team that's coming around the side. That's the same, like set it up, get it off, and then we're kind of repositioning as we're going. But that's like a micro example, but it also maps onto the macro illustration of the whole situation, where the setup at the very beginning, getting the orders, checking the equipment, what are we doing, where are we going, what are the different fire teams, whatever the way it's broken down in an org perspective. And then there's the get it off bit, which is the actual engagement in the combat scenario, or the mission is completed itself. And then there's the reposition bit, which is after that particular engagement. Yeah. Now we're actually, again, literally repositioning to move on to another target. So in that sense, it works at the same concept, works at a micro level within the combat scenario and a macro level around the whole thing. And it's the same with fighting as well, is that we're training for a fight, then we have the fight, and at the end of it, after the fight's done, we're repositioning in terms of we're getting organized, move on to the next target, whether it's the next competition, the next fight or whatever. So it's the same concept at a micro level within the ring in a split second to set up a particular shot and then get out of the way, all the way up to a career at one fight at a time.
Yeah, I should just give credit there to mkbartlett.co.uk. We'll throw those into the show notes there, but basically, you can get those battle drills there, and whether people may have been in different militaries or have different interpretations or slight differences on them, so but it'll be generally the same kind of principle. So Musashi then says here as well about he says, the science of martial arts is not just a matter of reading these writings. Taking what is written here personally, do not think you are reading or learning, and do not make up any imitation. Taking the principles as if they were discovered from your own mind, identify with them constantly and work on them carefully. Now, my interpretation of this, Karen, here, what's interesting here is I think about lots of, like what we spoke about in previous episodes, all these kind of fake martial arts. It's the same kind of thing as well. Like if you're not doing a martial art, like what John Danaher says, where it's got some realism or sparring or, some sort of simulated, event, there's no point in doing it. So you're not working on it continuously. You're just throwing shapes. Like, you're like two lads in the handball alley fighting in high school and in secondary school. If anybody from Ireland would be familiar with handball alleys, it's a bit like a squash court, and they would have them at schools. It's a Gaelic games, but people would go in there to fight. It was like a little dome. Like people would go in and fight in there and close the cage and the door, and people would fight in there, handball alley. But lads would get in there and throw shapes, and just not really engage or do anything. It was all posturing and bullshit. It's the same with some of these martial arts as well. If there's no realism in it, yeah, it might be fun, but understand it for what it is. Yeah, you go in there, be flexibility, bit of community, teamwork and so on. That's fine, not against that. I think it's great. But don't think you're going to go in there and do Wing Chun on a dummy and come out then and be like Steven Seagal, because it ain't going to happen. Because the minute you get slapped in the fucking head, the lights will turn on and it'll be a different show for you.
And you have that, we talked about this in a previous episode as well, and even just before the mic went on, about certain, like in academia, engineers can get away with a lot less bullshit than social scientists or philosophers, because the bridge either stays up or it doesn't. There's a lot less room for highfalutin kind of theory than there would be in certain academic fields. Like we previously talked about the grievance studies affair and how they could get Hitler's Mein Kampf published just by swapping in feminist buzzwords, because it wasn't connected to reality. They could get away with all sorts of nonsense and still get it published and still be considered academia. Same way that in martial arts that don't have something like jiu-jitsu or Thai boxing or wrestling or boxing, are Brazilian jiu-jitsu or Thai boxing or wrestling or whatever. You're constantly, just like an engineer, you're having your structures tested, you're having your ideas bounced off reality itself. And if your ideas don't work, then the bridge falls down. Same way that the submission doesn't come off, the sweep doesn't come off, the punch doesn't land, you don't get out of the way, whatever. Whereas in these other martial arts that are more kind of for aesthetics or
compliance
motor
based,
learning or more spiritual, just kata based, that's a different thing. That's a different thing to engineering or to an engineering discipline or a scientific discipline, because there isn't any contact with reality to check your ideas from like a combat sense. So it's far a different aim. It's the same way that in the grievance studies affair, in the academic sense, to just reference back to that because it's such a funny one, is that there's a reason that they could get Hitler's Mein Kampf published in a feminist journal just by swapping out the anti-Semitic stuff and swapping in anti-man stuff, is because that journal itself wasn't contacting with reality. There wasn't any checks and balances. There wasn't anything. Reality wasn't bouncing off those ideas. So as a result, it could drift away into fairyland. But the problem occurs then if people conflate the fact that they're able to get something published or that they're part of this academic discipline. And if they conflate it just because they've gotten some ideas published in this journal and they've gotten some funding for some research, that equates them to have the same form of knowledge as an engineer or a scientist. That's where the problem occurs, because they're different forms of knowledge, because one of those forms hasn't been stress tested by reality, whereas the other one has. And they're chalk and cheese in that respect. So,
but you see people doing this, Kieran, today, like with the pandemic, right? And we're not going to get into a vaccination rabbit hole, but you see people like discussing things like, oh, the testing was this or the vaccination does this. And you go, okay, why is that? And the reaction is like, well, I'm evidence-based. Okay, so where's like the masks is a classic one. I'm evidence-based. I'm evidence-based. All right, so numerous systematic reviews or meta-analysis show that masks have very low efficacy in terms of stopping coronavirus spread. That's not true. That's not true. No, that's not true. That's if you're evidence-based, that is the evidence. So it's not about so people like to use evidence-based as a proxy for this is what I fucking think and this is what I'm going to ram down your throat. So again, that's like this highfalutin, non-reality type of scientific method, which is invading our lives at the moment, which people do. But
it's actually science. I wouldn't even think of it as science, because it's more scientism. It's taking particular scientific opinions as if they are dogmatic truths that are unquestionable, which in itself is precisely the opposite of the scientific method. It's the exact wrong way around. Because we were discussing off mic that scientific knowledge that's generated by a body of knowledge is only ever transient truth. And this evidence-based practice, the way that gets tossed around in this very kind of watered down format, whereas it ignores, like, if you look at my favorite actual description of the evidence-based practice concept is from, I think it's from medicine. Well, the whole concept is from medicine. The actual, do you ever see, like, I like to think of it as the stool, the three-legged stool, where there's three legs going, and each of the legs, represents a different strand of knowledge that's feeding into the decision-making process. One is the literature that currently exists on a particular topic. And maybe also you could include on that mechanistic reasoning for a particular topic.
Yeah.
So that if the evidence doesn't exist yet, maybe there's some mechanistic reasoning behind it. The second component would be the expertise of the practitioner at that time. That would be the second leg. So expertise of that particular practitioner, and also the expertise that they've managed to garner from other practitioners in the field as well, because research, as you know, is few years, if not longer, behind what's taking place in the field. So there's a lag period there.
At least 2 years, I'd say.
And then there's a third component then, which is the specifics of, in a medicine sense, it would be the patient. In an athletic sense, it would be the client or the athlete. The specifics of their situation, because we can't fit squares into circles. So then there's those three sources of knowledge, and then we sit on the stool, and then sometimes we're more tilted towards one leg or two legs than we're drawing on what we can draw on to formulate an opinion given different source of knowledge. Whereas that's to me what evidence-based practice is. Whereas what the word often gets tossed around with is that if it's not in the literature, then it doesn't exist in the universe. that's scientism to me. Whereas if people are like, there's a particular viewpoint that they're thinking of, not even just in the literature, but it's even worse than not even that it doesn't exist in literature. It doesn't support their currently extant bias.
Yeah. And they get their science. Yeah, and they get their scientific fact or scientism, as you say, from a politician, a business leader, or somebody else, and they think then that's the gospel. And so, as we've seen with numerous areas of like climate change, pandemics, and other things as well, there isn't a balanced approach. We don't have the fors and the against. This kind of scientific method and discourse is not allowed to happen because, like we were talking about before, which should have been a podcast we recorded, and I try to do this in my own writing and with students as well, anybody I'm collaborating with. When we get to discussion of an experiment that we're doing, we should say in our paragraph, we should lead off like about, this is what we found. Here's what supports it or is similar to it. Here's what doesn't support it. And then what does that mean in terms of practical application? And that's how we should basically form the backbone of every paragraph in a discussion paper, I find. And I'm always welcome to new approaches on that. But I think that's a nice way to summarize each topic. If we take 4 points that we want to talk about in our discussion of a scientific paper, we have to show what's for it. We have to show what's against it. Because if we have a crazy finding, but all the other findings are against it, then maybe the practical component is that we need to redo this experiment, or didn't have the right methods to do it, or we had superior methods and the other papers were inferior methods. So it's a bit like a classic one in exercise physiology will be VO2 maxes in a lab when you're doing lactate and you got someone on a treadmill and, you're doing all these things and you got like a mask on and measuring respiratory effort and so on. That's a great way of measuring VO2 max, as opposed to, somebody doing a Queen's College step test, which, it's got some correlation to it, but it's not a VO2 max or how VO2 max is read off a watch. So if I'm doing a VO2 max test, a measure of someone's aerobic capacity in a lab, and all the other literature is about Garmin watches or whatever watches it might be that say VO2 max, well, that's not the gold standard. It's not a good standard to compare against. So in context, our level of evidence is far superior, even though these all found the others, the opposite. But we've also shown that maybe the methodology of how these things assess VO2 max is quite poor. So you got to put it in context every time. This kind of like one statement that this works and this doesn't. If you read that stuff in science, I'd put down your glasses, I'd light up a cigarette or a joint, and I'd think about it deeply, because when you see stuff like that written, it's generally not the case. Most scientists will say, this is what we know, but, or, however, or it depends, or in context, and think about, Like this kind of one statement it's bullshit. And we're on the verge here going on a scientific rabbit hole.
And it's a total misrepresentation of what science actually is. Like there's this unwillingness to acknowledge uncertainty. So like there's an unwillingness to acknowledge the fact that science only ever is shades of gray. And that's it. It's like, because we can never get to ultimate truth in any domain. Yeah. Because there's always the possibility for unknown knowledge in any domain. So like there's infinite mystery underneath every aspect of reality, because we can never know if there's something we don't yet know. There's always the possibility for unknowledge or non-knowledge, depending on how we want to phrase it. So like in that kind of sense there this is the trick as well. This is the tricky bit, is that, so there's this kind of concept of the consensus knowledge on X shows, or the scientific consensus on this topic shows. The problem of that, of course, is on one side, there is wisdom in crowds, but there can also be madness in crowds. Both, depending on the topic. So like it's if we know very little about a topic, it's probably a good idea to go with the consensus, because we don't have enough awareness to filter out bullshit or separate wheat from chaff. We can't separate bad science from BS, bad science from a potential heretical but innovative leap, because every scientific innovation is a heresy of one. Like every scientific innovation is someone going against the grain and generating a new idea. So there's two of those things that can be taken at. This is the tricky bit. Is that on one side, consensus is powerful because there's loads of minds that are ideally not just being sheep, but are actually coming to the same conclusion from different angles. Hopefully that's what's happening whenever you have a consensus on an idea, for the most part. But so then there's some wisdom in there, hopefully. But the other side of it is that every scientific innovation is heresy. So we have to be able to hold both of those things in our mind at any one time, and then take those two heuristics into any time we're formulating a decision. Because people thought Einstein was wrong and that there's no way he's after undoing Newton when he presented his field equations in 1915 to the Prussian Academy of Sciences. So for 3 or 4 years, Einstein wasn't famous, wasn't really well known, until Arthur Eddington sent out those 2 expeditions to take a photo of the eclipse. And all of a sudden they were like, oh shit, Einstein is actually onto something. Einstein made a prediction that Newton couldn't. Holy fuck, he's after undoing 300 years.
Or the Higgs boson, when the what do you call that machine there at CERN? What do you call that thing?
Oh yeah, the Large Hadron Collider.
The Large Hadron Collider. That discovered that the Higgs boson was at a certain point, and basically for years people didn't believe him and shouted him down. And then when that happened, they all stood up in that auditorium and clapped him, and he cried. You can see it on YouTube. I know a guy as well that discovered something in the sleep field 20-something years ago. People still tell him that he's wrong. So it's like, and it's just basically because they don't want to believe it. Because he found something in a different field that he's not actually an expert in, but he found it in there. But I think you're right, Kieran, as well. As I'm laughing here because we published a systematic review before Christmas on travel fatigue and jet lag in athletes. And we basically found that there's fuck all on proven interventions. So what did we do? 20-something of us, we wrote a consensus paper. The consensus paper was just accepted last week for publication. It's currently in press. And before this podcast, I got an email about it. That's why I'm giggling, because you're talking about lack of proof, then a consensus paper will be written. Now, I hope that consensus paper leads people and teams and organizations to go, wow, let's do research from this. This is what we know now, but hopefully that stimulates that. That's not the line in the sand and that goes, oh, we have this figured out. This is like actual fact. We went up the hierarchy of scientific methodology. We went and tried to do a systematic review. We found fuck all, really. So we wrote a consensus paper in the meantime, but let's get busy, boys and girls out here. We need to do something.
But that's the generation of, in that sense, that's what it should be. But it's you're not presenting that information as if it is some kind
standard.
of
No.
Whereas in other fields, like I don't have the expertise or the knowledge to question or to interpret or develop any strong opinions against the consensus in something like climate change, let's say. I don't have a notion. But what I do find fascinating is the black sheepery that happens of anyone within the scientific community who goes against the grain. That's what's worrying to me. It's like
more importantly, Kieran, who asks a question, not even goes against the grain, asks a contradictory question.
Yeah, to even raise, because that is fundamentally antithetical to science as an actual endeavor. Is like, whereas science works where anything is on the table. And that's, funnily enough, actually, and bring it back to Musashi, is that, so I'll give one example for anyone who's interested here, is like someone who's a kind of a free thinker, kind of idol of mine, who only died there, was it earlier this year? It was a Freeman Dyson was his name, who's a mathematician, physicist, just kind of a polymath character. But for decades, he's been kind of going against the grain on climate change and talking about carbon sequestration in the soil and the importance of the soil. And he's kind of been somewhat of a scientific heretic in that domain. And there just was this kind of, he was literally seen as partaking in some kind of a heresy. And he actually kind of even played on it. Like, he's got presentations online about being a heretic, but it wasn't because of it. He wasn't trying to be argumentative for its own sake. He was actually just presenting the information as he saw it, and he was willing to say what he saw regardless of the consequences. So, and I don't, as I said, I don't have a notion about any of this. But what worries me is any time questioning of a consensus is suppressed, that's an indication, it's a fucking red flag, because it's totally antithetical to the inherently humble nature to the study of nature itself, given the fact that infinite mystery underpins every aspect of reality, because we can never get to ultimate truth.
So speaking about that, like, it's interesting here because Musashi says as well, it is essential for those who are physically small to know what it is like to be large. And for those who are physically large to know what it is like to be small. So again, it's that opposite thing. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it bad? Is it good? Putting yourself on the other side of the equation, looking back and testing things as well. If you're small and athletic, for example, in martial arts, you have the ability to move, be quick, be agile. But if you're big, you have the ability to maybe suppress and control. And it's very different types of things. But in general life as well, just because you're full of energy in a business, you might gain some benefit from maybe slowing down and be more, that energy and that high paced activity and trying to get things done is good, but you may benefit from being a bit more the opposite, a bit more slow, methodical, a bit more thoughtful about what you're doing as well. And there's that kind of yin and yang, this duality that we keep seeing time and time again, which I seem to be fascinated with, and I can't get out of my head. But again, it's back to your point about consensus papers. It's about looking back and forth. It's like climate change. It's about asking the questions. And I think what you can do as a starting point for anybody is ask the questions to yourself in your own work first. You don't have to go out and start a fight with anybody. You can ask the questions to yourself. I think that's an interesting approach. That's what Musashi says there.
And that same concept, to continue in the kind of Musashi thread off, that same concept is just as, like, the way he presents his style of fighting, I absolutely love, because like we talked about with Sonny, like we talked about in previous episodes, his style of fighting, he happens to have two swords, etc. And he has this style of the two sword school, but his style is basically the water fills the vessel. That's like Bruce Lee's, like the water fills the cup, the water fills the jug, takes the form.
Water, my friend. Yeah,
and that's where that's where I'd imagine Bruce Lee got it from, because he had that back injury and spent a year in bed and did all this writing and everything, and there's a lot of similarities in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. There's elements that cross over. It wouldn't surprise me, because I don't think he ever mentioned Musashi. I don't remember coming across that in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. Maybe he did, but the concept.
Can I show you something? Can I show you something there? Well, I want to show you this because you're going to love this. This is live here. Hold on. Well, it's not live. It's recorded. Well, it's live with me.
What do we have here? What is that?
See that? That is a beautiful book. That is a collector's edition by Bruce Lee, The Tao of Jeet Kune Do. Now watch this, Karen. Watch this. It slides out this beautiful cover here, this box.
That's savage. The cover is even class, man.
And then it comes out like that.
Class.
How beautiful is this? Now look at the beautiful pages in this book. It's got everything in there. Everything. It's like nice and crisp.
The way it's laid out. Yeah.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful book, right? And lovely and gold, right? Got great illustrations inside it as well. That is a collector's edition from the Bruce Lee shop that arrived here a couple of weeks ago. They like that, Karen?
That is actually beautiful. That's a good use of the word.
Beautiful. Now, Karen, do you want me to let you know something? You know the way I love you and you're my friend?
Yeah.
And I said to you last week, I have a present coming to you. That's what's on its way to you right now.
Class.
The book is on its way to you. That's what's coming.
Savage.
Now, I was going to just leave it as a surprise, but since you brought up, I thought this would actually be a nice way to show you what you're getting. And I thought,
savage.
I'll ask you what you think of that first. That's on the way to you, my friend. That's a gift from me to you for starting off this great podcast. So yeah, that's a beautiful book. And we'll break this down in terms of the podcast one of the days, because we're both fans of Bruce Lee, and I've got some great pictures from the Bruce Lee Museum in Hong Kong as well. So we can on another episode we'll break that down. But I think you're right. I think there's lots of similarities here with Bruce Lee's philosophy, and I love Bruce Lee as a philosopher. And I think that's the cool thing about martial arts. There's so much philosophy in it as well. There's so much deep thought, and I think Bruce Lee, for whatever he did in cinema, whatever he did to inspire people, his philosophy I think is his lasting legacy in my opinion anyway. And it's a beautiful.
Because that's what transcends. That's what keeps going, even though. Because in that Tao of Jeet Kune Do, like he's got descriptions and drawings of armbar techniques.
It's all in there, yeah.
So like he was very similar to Musashi in that it was just like that's why Bruce Lee was seen as a heretic against the kung fu that he was brought up in. Because he was willing to do his own thing. So he was willing to just do his own thing. And that's where he has that beautiful concept, Bruce Lee, would absolutely love. And it epitomizes Musashi as well in the Book of Water, where it's absorb what is useful, discard what is not, and add what is uniquely your own. That's what it's all about. It's about whatever is useful to get the job done. And that's what we're doing even here in this podcast. It's like we're going across elements of science, philosophy of science, stuff we know about from neuroscience and modern psychology, as well as 2,500 year old Buddhism, whatever Zen, Stoicism, whatever it is that's useful, we'll just absorb it. And then whatever isn't, we won't. And then it's a matter of what gets the job done. And regardless of where it comes from, let's not be dogmatic. Let's be humble and open to alternatives. For sure, yeah. And what's interesting here as well, like I think in this water scroll as well, how he starts to break down these little chunks. And he moves into this, as a precursor, he says, there is something special about knowledge of the art of war. And I think like, it's not just about the art of war per se, it's the pursuit of the art of war that gives us so much more. And so the first part he talks about is the physical bearing in martial arts. He talks about things like your gaze should be steady, narrow your eyes slightly, right? Tightening the wedge, bracing your body. What I get from that, Karen, is actually about physical preparation of your body. I think in a world today when so many people are getting obese and overweight, you've got, 70% of people being in this category. And you see so many people. Or the opposite, and just getting like massive muscular atrophy at age. Yeah. That they're just physically, people are physically frail and becoming incapacitated, even if they're not obese, because they're just not maintaining movement capacity and muscle mass as they age. On the other side as well. Yeah, and this actually kind of gets into an area which has become a little bit probably central to what I'm doing at the moment. So I've been working actually with a friend of mine called Mark Bubbs, and I'll show you his books. I have about 50 copies here on the shelf. Mark Bubbs has this book called Peak 40, The New Science of Midlife Health for a Leaner, Stronger Body and a Sharper Mind. And he's written a book before called Peak, and he's featured some of my research in it. He's got a great podcast called Peak, but he's also got a podcast called Peak 40. And it's really aimed at people sort of in my age bracket, 35 to 55. And I'm sort of slap bang in the middle of that now. And so I think like when you talk about physical bearing and martial arts, and I had a conversation with Jason Donaldson today, who's been on my podcast a number of times, Sleep for Performance Radio. So he's the breathing guy. He does he does some breathing stuff as well, Jason. Yeah, so he should. That's where I come across him. I don't know much about him, but I remember whatever I did come across, I found him an interesting character. Yeah, ex-copper, and sort of ran a CrossFit gym and stuff like that. But this is the thing as well. It's about the physical bearing in martial arts, having your body physically ready. And so, again, coming back to balance of things, I was going too far with too much training. I was redlining my body, running too much, doing too many things and getting sick. So now, it's not that I'm going to get lazy, but I have to kind of go, right, I'm 43. I need to calm down. As Mark said to me, you're 43. You can't train like you're in your 30s, and you certainly can't train like you're in your 20s. I was doing 14 hours of exercise a week, blasting myself and then calling myself lazy. So, and I was getting sick and gaining weight. I wound that back, took a bit of a break, lost about half a stone nearly, or 6-7 pounds, feeling better mental acuity. Everything's kind of going in the right direction. So it's about finding that balance as well. And to your point as well, as you get older, you want to have that kind of, that resistance as well. So for me, exercise is about, and physical preparation is not about being jacked right here and now. It's about being healthy here and now. And more importantly, being healthy till the day I die. Because I want to swim or get choked or walk or run into the grave. I ain't going into one of these fucking homes incapacitated. There's no way. So for me, this is about the physical bearing, treating life as a lifelong journey, as it is. And I've always been physically active, not burning like you look at some of those fighters, right? Don Fry was on Rogan recently. He's only 55. The man's had a stroke. He was forgetting things. He said he struggled to remember names. Mark Coleman's in his 50s. Some of these guys, awesome athletes, and hats off to them and great respect to them. But they've burnt themselves out in such a short space of time. So it's about this kind of physical bearing, long-term, making sure your body is ready for it. That's what I get out of that short paragraph. I love that, man. There's there's that balance to strike that I find is interesting in and amongst that, where we don't know where the edge is until we've crossed it. So like we kind of need to go through periods as athletes or as someone, even in any aspect of life, we need to go over the edge to be able to find out where the edge is. And someone who's only just getting into training as a teenager or as a kid, or someone as an adult who's getting into an aspect of physical culture, it's something like you just said there is going to be very hard for them to understand unless they themselves have gone over that edge and have been in those states of overtraining, overcooking, and it's not even just the overtraining element, it's the psychological stuff that goes with that, where other aspects of our lives suffer as a result of putting overemphasis on a particular aspect. So like there's time and a place where, and I talked to a group of athletes about this recently, where there is a time and a place to redline it and to go put the pedal on the floor. And there's times and places where that's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a useful thing to do and it's the best thing to do. But that's not all the time. There's also a time and a place where it's advisable, if not, and it's the best thing you could potentially do for your athletic performance, is to be at a birthday party and have some junk food and have a few beers with your mates. That's probably, there are also times where that's one of the best things you could do, but you won't know what they are until you fucked up at either end, until you've had too many of the days at the wrong occasions where you've had too much to drink and too much fucking cake or junk food. Similar, and you won't know when, and then unless you've gotten to the other side as well, where you've had periods where you've redlined it for too long when it wasn't necessary, and you've sacrificed the capacity, and you showed up at a birthday party with fucking a chicken breast inside and a bit of tin foil or some fucking or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, until you've been at those extremes, you won't know how to moderate. So you kind of, it's like there's the ability to recognize an interdependency of opposites and recognize balance, but not until we found where the edges are.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that's the thing. It's about shaping your life, and you got to push them in different ways. And it's going to be like 10 years ago, I could find a balance, but I wasn't doing as much jiu-jitsu, for example, or I wasn't doing other stuff. But 10 years is a long time. But what's interesting is like when you push the line, I think if I was a single bloke, I probably could have kept pushing and pushing it. But what was interesting was I was starting to turn into an asshole at home. Like I was irritable, wasn't sleeping well. I was moody. My wife said to me, like, you are fucking so moody lately. And it was because basically this overtraining and what I was doing was, you know, jacking up all my, like, I'm not going to go into detail of what happened, but basically like I was fucked, right? So all my blood markers were off the charts in terms of bad in different ways. Testosterone was low and some other things. So I was like, man, I got to make a change here. I can't live like this. I can't be ticking a box on one side of the equation going on, doing all this activity. I'm awesome. But then not having any energy to work, and my wife avoiding me because I was an asshole. And within 2 or 3 weeks of stopping that and going back doing more swimming, which is non-weight bearing, my mood, man, dramatically increased. It was interesting to see. But 6 months ago, I was kind of like over swimming, like, oh, I'm swimming too much. I need to go back running. I need to get back out. But it's interesting, like you said, you push it, then you go, broke that, and I come back, which is similar to our scientific method conversation. I tried to break that, I broke it, and now I'm going to come back, and this is what it is. We got to do that. We got to test these things.
Yeah.
Now, the other one here, Karen, goes on to as well, and this is one I always talk about in martial arts. This is one of my favorite fucking things in jiu-jitsu, right? The eyes are to be focused in such a way as to maximize the range and breadth of vision. In martial arts, it is important to be aware of opponent's swords and yet not look at the opponent's swords at all. This takes work. So one of the things, right, that I see a lot of white belts and blue belts struggling with, and I did it to a guy last week and we both started laughing. He was about maybe 100 kilos and he was inside my guard and he was trying to pass. And he was grabbing the jiu-jitsu gi and grabbing it. And he got the grips, and he had really good grips. So he was pulling me this way and pulling me that way with the grips. So I just had my 2 hands out in front of me. He had 2 grips on, but then I brought the hands back towards my chest and crossed my arms. But he didn't know when to let go of the grips. So now his grips were nearly null and void because I just went like this. Then I took my two hands out in front of me, and then I moved them out to the left, and he followed them with his eyes. Then I moved them out to the right, and he followed them with his eyes. So he took his eyes completely off of me and kept following the hands. I did it one more time. He looked at me and laughed. And then really quickly, I pulled him over to the right, arm dragged him and took his back and choked him. Because his eyes weren't focused on me. They were focused on the hands. So coming back to position, I was in a bad position. I unbalanced him because he was attached to me. I used deception by moving him around. And then I arm dragged him, more unbalanced again, leaving another little step in there, and then a submission. And this is what happens heaps. And you probably see it in boxing as well. People are looking at the hand. You do a jab and someone goes like that and looks at it, where they should be kind of looking, I think, common to all martial arts. I said to people, draw a crucifix over them or look between their chest hair. I don't care if it's a woman or a man. You're not looking at them in a sexual manner. You're looking at them right here, right there in the middle of their chest. Because once you focus there, you can see everything moving off there. The minute you start looking at something moving, you're gone. Is that the same in striking, Kieran?
Yeah, in striking, and it would depend on the range as well. So like imagine in boxing where the range is closer because the length of the strike is obviously the length of an arm. Whereas in kickboxing, the distance is a bit greater. So if we're in like medium range boxing, I'm going to be kind of roughly hovering my eyes at the middle of your chest. And to the best of my knowledge, the peripheral vision actually picks up on movement faster than the direct, what we're actually staring at. So if I'm looking at you roughly around the solar plexus, kind of middle of the chest, my peripheral vision will pick up on even micro movements of your shoulder before your hand is coming my way and moving to the head. But then imagine if the range is larger and I'm further away from you, then I'm going to be looking a little bit lower, closer to the belly button because I need to be able to see the movement of your feet and your shoulders. So my peripheral vision needs to be able to pick up a larger potential source of targets or weapons. So because the legs are involved now and you can kick me in the head. So I'm going to be looking slightly lower in a kickboxing scenario because my peripheral vision needs to take in a larger area because the distance is further and the legs are more likely to be coming at me at that range than a hand would be.
Yeah.
But there's an element there that I wanted to touch on. There's a particular line. So this is you went on to the gaze in strategy, whereas on my translation here, between spiritual bearing in strategy and the gaze in strategy, there's a line here that I absolutely love. It's that in all forms of strategy, it is necessary to maintain the combat stance in everyday life and to make your everyday stance your combat stance. You must research this well. And to me, that's not just a physical stance, like the way that I'm actually standing in the world, in like a simplistic, how am I walking around with my right foot in front and my fucking like shuffling around.
You walk around like this.
Yeah.
Like a boxer.
Yeah. Whereas like walking around Tesco's, just my fucking hands up, like all the, it's like
get over your way.
Yeah. It's the everything. It's the countenance. It's like practicing composure. Like it's like he has a phrase here earlier on where he says something like, both in fighting and in everyday life, you should be determined though calm. And my phrase for that is determined though calm. So that there's an urgency about things, but you're not rushing. There's an urgency to participate or to get things done, but you're not rushing to the extent that you're making a bollocks of it. And there's that element, and I like to think about the phrase, and I love the phrase, aggressive patience.
Yeah.
That's what I think is like, there's an aggressive patience about life. That's how I kind of think of it. So like that concept of make your fighting stance, your everyday stance, your fighting stance, is that whatever state of mind we'd like to be able to recreate in a fighting scenario, that we in our everyday life practice, because the stance isn't just, while it's bi-directional, the stance that we take physically can alter the psychological state, but also the psychological state that we adopt can alter our stance. So it's bi-directional, physical stance.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's also about practicing. So even in something like public speaking, Like if I was getting butterflies before public speaking, I can use the same cueing. If I'm giving a presentation or I'm talking to a team or whatever, I can use the same cueing to get to that place of aggressive patience or kind of that determined though calm state. I can use the same cueing there while I'm waiting for my turn to go up and speak or whatever, and I can use the same thing there as I could. I'm just about to get into a cage or a boxing ring. It's the same to get, and it doesn't mean that I want to eat. And it's more being able to, or a
Focus.
job interview or something.
Yeah.
It's like this. It's the transmissible across all potential sources of stress, and it can be. And the more often we practice that, the more likely we are to be able to adopt that when the pressure really comes on.
I agree. I spoke to Nicholas Buck, who's a famous composer here in Australia, and he does lots of scores for movies. And I was quite surprised actually speaking to him when he listened to that podcast where he doesn't do a lot of physical preparation before he goes out onto stage. And when I did my TED talk, there was 2,000 people in the audience, and I purposely that day didn't wear, like as in clothing, I didn't wear the clothes I was going to talk in. I left them in the green room, which I had access to. And then about 45 minutes beforehand, I went into that green room, did some stretching, kind of loosened myself out a little bit, had a bit of quiet time, a bit of focus time. 20 minutes to go, I got changed into like a pair of shoes, jeans, and a shirt. And then I was kind of ready, got mic'd up, went out then. I was treating like a fight. So I was kind of like ramping it up like a fight or an event or a sporting event or something I would do. And I get those moments of calm before an event. I also do when I used to do a lot of long distance running in the mountains, the day before I would start doing some focusing techniques, a bit like a fighter who would go in and look at an octagon or a ring or walk around an arena. I would go out sort of on my own for maybe 10, 15 minutes and I'd just have a walk around. And if it was the mountains I was going across, I'd look up at the mountain and I'd do a bit of a little kind of reflection, and I'd just say a kind of a prayer or an affirmation or just a something into the ether about like, look after me tomorrow. I'll treat you well. I'll run across this ground and I'll have a good day. I won't leave any bad sort of footprints. I won't throw any rubbish. I respect the fact that I'm alive and I can do this. So get me to the other end of this course and, it'll all be good. I also do it as well before I speak. If I go in and I want to give a presentation to a company, I'll basically go in and walk around the room before I start. I'll put something up on the projector. I'll walk down to the end of the room. I'll walk down to the other corner of the room. I'll walk down the middle of the room. If it's like 50 people, 60 people, I'll get a feel for the room and I'll break the chairs apart so I have a pathway to walk down so I can engage people. I don't want to sit there at the top and just lecture. So again, it's about that kind of focusing and getting yourself ready. And you might do that presentation 4 times in one day because you've got different groups coming in and the same process happens and you get a cadence and you're like a kind of a comedian. You're sharpening your story or your act across the day and you're getting in that zone. And when you get right onto it, man, it feels good. It just flows through you. You're just watching yourself do it, and then you start kind of just, hovering over the top of it. It's good to do. So that's, I think, the importance of focus as well. And that stance where these things combine. And if you're humped over or hunched over or, talking like this and this is this, and no one's going to give a fuck. Will you stand up, put your shoulders up, shoulders back, get some oxygen to your oxygen into your system, take a good, nice, big, deep breath, be positive, smile, engage people. You're going to have a good day. They're going to have a good day. Like we're all in this roller coaster together, so you might as well have a good day. No point being a moping fucking asshole,
Yes, yeah. And the thing is that it goes, my buddy Robbie had this beautiful phrase painted in his gym. It ended up closing down over the pandemic. And I think, and I'm happy for him. As a side note, there's, I'm sickened the place closed, but I'm delighted he no longer has to run a gym.
What's his name?
Same time, Robbie Burke or Robbie O'Driscoll, isn't it?
Oh, not Robbie Burke, the guy that has a podcast.
Sorry,
Robbie Burke has a podcast, isn't he?
No, that's a different. I was thinking Robbie Burke just slipped there because it was Robbie O'Driscoll. His name, a really good fella. He had a place, Cafe Move, that a jiu-jitsu gym is upstairs in Cafe Move. He's in the BJJ as well, but there was a BJJ Cork is upstairs. But he had a beautiful line painted on the wall that said, there is no mind, there is no body. Show me the space between the two. He had that painted on the wall somewhere inside in the gym. And so this is why that there isn't a space, there isn't a mind-body separation. there isn't a duality there, because where's the line? Where can we draw that line? So in that sense, when it comes to the psychological readiness or the psychological state that we can trigger with certain lenses that we can bring on ourselves, and interpretations of situations and motivations and intentions, that alters how we physically are in the world. And just like you said, that when you actually stand up and you stand a certain way, that can also feed into then the psychological state of mind that you end up holding, you know, and that there is it's bi-directional between psychological state and physical being in the world, and that because there isn't a separation between the two of them. It's just two different ways of thinking about the same process.
Yeah, and I think you're right with that, this bi-directional thing, or this duality that we talk about. It was like this morning, like it's been pretty cold here in Perth, like I said earlier on. It's like been 3-4 degrees in the morning, which is cold for here, right? And the houses sort of aren't built for it. The alarm clock went off this morning at 5:25 to go to the swimming pool, an outdoor swimming pool. Now, granted, it's heated, to an outdoor swimming pool to swim, right, for nearly 3 Ks, 5:25, pitch black, sun's not coming up really till about 7. I'm lying in bed, the alarm clock goes off. I'm like, fuck, I don't want to get up. Just don't want to. I'm just gonna send a message. So I write the message into the group that I'm going swimming with. I look at the message. I delete the message. I lie down. I look at the wall. I get back up. I write the message again. I delete the message. Oh, fuck's sake. And I just went, right, get up. Because I know if I get up, I know if I go do it, my day will be better for it and I'll feel better for it. And it did. I got in there and had a great morning, had a good swim. You know, I sort of got through the first part, which is quite difficult in some ways. Like it was just a bit tight, but I got through and it was good. And it was like, you know, it was something good. And it's sometimes we have to kind of push ourselves, like you're saying, to stand upright or to do something to make us push that way. And I'll just share this with you here I took a picture of it afterwards here, because that gives you a bit of an idea.
Class.
So like that. But I should have taken a picture when we got into the pool at the first thing at 6, because you couldn't even see that clock over on the wall. So we couldn't even do our repeat times. We were just counting in our heads before we go again. But it was like that, you know, and full moon was out over here on this side of the pool as well. Pitch black, no clouds and the steam coming up. It was like something out of a movie. And it was a great morning. Like,
I'd say there was a cool sense of camaraderie there as well with the people that you did the session with, because most likely everyone else that was there went through the same internal debate that you did that morning.
I had that chat at the end. We had that chat at the end, and that's why I wrote there, the foggy dew after a 2.8 K swim to get up to get the day started. Fucking hate getting up at 5:30, but it was worth it.
Yeah.
You know, and it's that thing about when you do stand up, even though you mightn't feel like it, or you want to feel positive, you know, you mightn't feel like it, or the days where you're like, oh, I feel like shit, and you go for a walk or a run, or you throw around some weights, it gets the endorphins going. It's that duality again, or that bi-directional thing. So I think it's a very important point about focusing on the body and the mind as well. And sure, it's not going to happen every day, but some days you go and you go, just it ain't happening today, I ain't feeling so good. But at least you give it a try. But 99 times out of 100, you will feel pretty good.
Yeah, there's a really cool, there's a Latin phrase that I really like, because it goes facta non verba, which means deeds before words.
Facta non verba. And I write that down there now.
Deeds before words, or deeds not words. That it's all about the actions. You know, it's not about what we say, it's about what we do. No, don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. Be about it, kind of a thing. You know.
How many people do you know like that? Talk like, I know people that are always on the verge, like of becoming a millionaire, on the verge of becoming the CEO, on the verge of, like, you know, winning a triathlon, on the verge of nearly being an MMA fighter. The next minute you look around and they're like 45, and you're like, oh yeah. You know,
there's something really, really fucking sad about that, where there's because there's an element, I don't know what it is, whether it's kind of like a self delusion as a kind of a coping mechanism, like, because I'm sure I have all sorts of delusions as well, but it's like almost like there's something kind of sad about not having got into the arena and given it a go.
Yeah,
you know, there's that essay that could be a brilliant podcast for us to do another day, the Man in the Arena essay, where it's like that there's something really sad about not having gone in and given it a go. You know, not having made that leap and gotten in and fucking put your skin in the game. You know, and the kind of delusions that we can tell ourselves as to why it was we didn't get in and put our skin in the game. You know, there's something kind of
and that's what anything, Karen, not just a physical activity. That's what anything.
Yeah.
I think that's
unwillingness to have got into the arena. Like,
I was reading there about Becker the other day, I know, which is what we were talking about in separate episodes, but that same thing where people just go to that, the what I call the mean or the average or the median, just go to that middle point where everything's nice and easy and people don't want to take a chance or they don't want to live their life how it should be. I think it's really sad to see people just do that and never, like you said, never take a chance, never do anything. People just coast along and, well, this is what I'm supposed to do, and they just follow this preordained footprints, where they're just walking through shapes in the ground, which is predestined or pre-filled out for them in their own mind. Not in
Nietzsche. There's a beautiful book called I don't know where Nietzsche actually wrote this in his writings, because I haven't read all of his stuff by any means, but there's a beautiful fiction book called When Nietzsche Wept, and it's written by a really famous psychotherapist called Irvin Yalom, who's a psychotherapist and psychiatrist based in California. And it's a phenomenal book. It's based around this basically this concept of a kind of a young, or a Nietzsche in the late 1800s, mid 1880s kind of time, where Sigmund Freud is a young fella, and Sigmund Freud's mate, who was one of the founders of kind of modern psychology and neuroscience, a guy called Brouwer is his name. And they basically Yalom took these real life characters and made a fictional story about it, as if what would have happened if Nietzsche went for counseling with this fella Brouwer. And Brouwer was mates with Freud. And Freud was only just getting into this idea of talk therapy and developing his ideas. So this young fella Freud chatting to Brouwer, and Brouwer is chatting to Nietzsche, but Freud doesn't know that it's Nietzsche. So then there's this really interesting situation going on. But one of the lines that Nietzsche has in this as a character, which I'm sure that Yalom is an expert in existential philosophy and in Nietzsche, so I'm sure he got this from somewhere Nietzsche wrote this. I never actually looked up the original quote. But Nietzsche at one point tells Brouwer to consummate his life. To actually consummate his life. That concept of, you consummate a marriage.
Yeah.
He's like, consummate your life, man. You're not getting stuck in here. Like, you're just kind of flowing along, taking the easy option. You're not actually engaging with the deep, dark questions. You're not fully living as if you're only going to have one of these lives. You're not actually getting after it in the awareness that you're going to die, man. So consummate your life and get into it.
So just pausing on that one there for a second, that consummate your life. That's an interesting choice of words to use. And I like it. And last year in discussion with a clinical psychologist, he gave me another, what I call a caliper to put against your life. This was the things, and I can't remember where he said this was from, but there's 3 things a man or a person should ask themselves. And he was saying this as into me, as a man. 3 things you should ask yourself. Who am I? Where am I going? And who's coming with me? And I pondered on those 3 points for about 2 months. Who am I? Where am I going? And who's coming with me? And if you can answer those 3 things, you're on the right path. So we could have that one, and then plus your calipers earlier on that you said. What was the one you said about what was it, Mia? Was it Mia?
Maya Angelou.
That one.
Yeah. Do I like who I am? Do I like what I'm doing? Do I like how I'm doing it?
That's nearly like the reciprocal of those 3 points.
Yeah.
That's like a quality measure on the other one's, like kind of a directional target.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Quality. Look at that.
Yeah.
They actually fit in quite nice.
Yeah.
So
that's brilliant. Yeah, that's a fucking beautiful complementary pairing of questions, because that's the directionality, and then that's beautiful.
And one is like the direction, and the other is the quality of it.
Yeah,
there's kind of a caliper you can put against your life, I think, which is quite cool.
Class.
And this is kind of cool as well here, Karen, because looking at the water scroll again, he talks here about gripping the long sword. And obviously a lot of people will look at this and go, oh, fucking swords. Like, who carries their own swords? You'd be surprised. But anyway, who carries their own swords, you know? And like, how does this really pertain to our life today? But you look at some of the things here and you try and extrapolate out in today's world. Like, so we spoke to Sonny about gripping, right, in martial arts, but let's look at it in a different way. And this is why I say this is the book that keeps on giving. You know, every time you read this, you get something else over. In wielding the long sword, the thumb and forefinger grip lightly. The middle finger grips neither tightly nor loosely. While the fourth and little fingers grip tightly, there should be no slackness in the hand. Right? The long sword should be taken up with thought that it is something for killing opponents. Let there be no change in your grip, even when slashing opponents. Make your grip such that your hand does not flinch. When you strike an opponent's sword, lock it or pin it. Your thumb and forefinger alone should change somewhat, but in any case, you should grip your sword with the thought of killing. Your grip when cutting something to test your blade and your grip when slashing in combat should be no different, gripping the sword as you would to kill a man. Generally speaking, fixation and binding are to be avoided in both the sword and the hand. Fixation is the way to death. Fluidity is the way to life. This is something that should be well understood. Now, to me, Karen, that's like practice with purpose. Pick up your tool, go about your job, and do it to get it done. Don't fuck around like what you were saying about procrastination. Again, if you're going to do something, do it. If you're only going to spend 20 minutes on it, spend 20 minutes on it. But don't be sitting here like writing an email or a document whilst fucking around on YouTube, looking at Instagram, trying to do all this multitasking. If you're going to do it, do it. Grab it by the balls, put your head down and get on with it and get it done. And I think this is what a lot of people kind of suffer with. Me included, by the way. I have this battle on a daily basis. Like we spoke with Greg Bennick. We're speaking about Becker's work, that same thing about the war of art, not the art of war, but the war of art, trying to get yourself through these things and getting rid of these distractions. So for me, this paragraph here is along those lines.
And I really like that last line in particular. That concept, we've come back to it over and over again in discussing Musashi, but it's all about getting the job done. And this is what's applicable from Musashi that's generalizable across any other aspect of our lives. It's like legitimately looking at, well, what is the superfluous shite here that I can get rid of because it's only getting in the way? What's the fluff here that I can get rid of? Is what I'm doing, if this is what I'm trying to orientate toward, is this other stuff over here actually useful at allowing me to orientate in this direction? So it's like, that's why I love this idea of fixedness. I mean, the way it's worded in my version of it here, I've got two different versions with me depending on what I'm trying to draw on, but it says fixedness means a dead hand, pliability is a living hand. You must bear this in mind. So that's how my last couple of sentences are phrased versus yours. And that idea of fixedness means a dead hand, that if we're rigidly locked into a particular way that we feel something needs to be done a certain way and we're not willing to apply new methods, or we're not willing to go with the flow and make adjustments and be agile in our approach, we're
be
fucked.
Like water.
Exactly. Whereas that pliability is a living hand, that agility, that ability to make decisions on the fly, to adjust to reality as reality itself is changing, and to have a toolbox to be able to navigate changing circumstances and not to be locked into a kind of a dogmatic, rigid approach of trying to do something or a way of trying to force something. So like this is what Musashi, this concept over and over and over again, is you do what it takes to get the job done.
Like the scientific method as well. It's only as good as it is now, and you got to move on, and you got to apply the right tool for the right job, and you got to continually be searching and finding out. Yeah.
There isn't, as soon as you feel like you found truth, you're dead. You're stagnant.
Yeah.
You're done. You're like a stagnant pool of water. You're just going to start rotting.
Yeah. There is no done. There is no such thing as, you're done. People have said that to me before. Oh, have you finished now, like with education? No. There's no done. What are you going to do next? I don't know. But I'm going to move into purpose. It mightn't be a formal education, but I'm going to be trying to educate myself every day. And then like you know, someone said to me a few years ago, what's next to him? Blah, blah, blah. I don't know. Maybe when I'm in my 50s, I might be a historian. What do you mean? So I would love to go back and do a PhD in philosophy and history. I would love to. And I think I will probably do that before I die. People are like, oh, it's such a waste of time. Maybe for you and not for me. Like, you know, this to me, this type of work and this type of stuff that we're talking about, give this to me any day. You give me a choice to go to Ibiza, take drugs and party, I'd rather sit here and talk like this, man. That's just me, where I am in my life at the moment. So, you know, that's, maybe we could do both. Maybe we could take drugs and talk about like this in a nightclub.
Yeah, the morning after discussions, maybe.
Sitting on the beach. So, Kieran, coming to the end of our episode on the water scroll, or today's episode on the water scroll. So after an hour and a half or more, an hour and 20 odd minutes, I think now, we've covered approximately 3.5 pages. But I want to end on this one here because I think you might have some insights into this. And this last section here is on footwork. And in our next episode, we're going to kick off with the 5 kinds of guards. But on this last one is in footwork. In your footwork, you should tread strongly on your heels while allowing some heavy leeway in your toes. Although your stride may be long or short, slow or fast, according to the situation, it is to be as normal. Flighty steps, unsteady steps, and stomping steps are to be avoided. Now, this is really interesting, Kieran, because I've done some Aikido and Kenjutsu, which is the art of drawing the sword and sword fighting. And I think there's a lot of similarities. Obviously, not being a trained boxer, only having very rudimentary experience in boxing and kickboxing for training. It's the same in stand-up, in judo, jiu-jitsu. It's the same in any effort in running, anything you do. If you're stomping, jumping around, banging on the ground, you're just, you know, bringing your feet together, you know, all these type of things, not paying attention to your footwork, being the base of the pyramid, the base up, you're doomed. Am I right?
Yes, the foundations, and particularly in think about the context in a fighting perspective alone for him is that if there's 3-foot razor blades being swung at each other, that at any moment in time he could get his head removed. So like he needs to be in a position constantly to be able to change distance or parry or block or launch a counter strike at any moment in time because of the significance of the situation. And that's how I kind of think of it in like in a striking sense as well in combat sport, and it's even the same in a stand-up and wrestling perspective, like when you're grappling or judo or whatever. Yeah. It's that you need to be in a position to be able to deal as often as possible to be able to navigate what's about to come your way or to be able to exploit what opening you've just seen. So if you're off balance with your feet, if you're overextended, or if you're too close together, or if you're not, that's why there's this idea of in combats, in striking, there's this concept of small steps. So small, frequent steps, little adjustments. Because if you're taking big steps, you're in the air for longer. And if you're in the air for longer, you're less likely to be able to adapt to something that's coming your way or to be able to exploit an opening that's just occurred. So there's this concept of making the adjustments on how we're moving such that we're able to exploit opportunities and also able to deal with incoming threats as often as possible, as much as possible throughout the duration of the encounter.
Yeah, that's what he says here. Be very sure not to step with 1 foot alone. This is something that demands careful examination. And I think if you like step out with 1 foot, like if you lunge, I'm not saying that there's times you don't lunge, and it might be something completely unorthodox as well, by the way. I think that sometimes will work in your advantage because people are like, what the fuck? He's not, never seen anybody doing that before. But if you lunge out in a particular aspect, like you're very susceptible to being unbalanced or to being struck or to being 3-foot razor blades, your head taken off, you know, depending on the outcome. Now, you might want to unbalance yourself in a certain way where the other person has to overextend.
Yeah.
Like you might step back at a very weird angle or off to the side where that you step back at a really weird angle and make a crazy shape where a person overextends, and then you're going to come in with a hook or a kick or an uppercut. You might use that reverse to them. So that's why he's saying about careful examination. And that's what I think.
Like, it's not rigid. It's like the way of no way. it's that fluidity there, because you know where you see this in a prime example. I can keep giving boxing examples because
Be like water.
that's what I'm most. It's what I'm most familiar with. Is like, because you see, prime example is Floyd Mayweather. Is that Floyd Mayweather will often do things in fights that are where he ends up throwing his right hand, especially if you can just specifically play on his right hand, is he'll throw his right hand in a way that puts him massively off balance and puts him way out over the front of his left leg. So his left leg is in front, his right hand's in the back, and he'll throw his right hand, he'll just kind of pop it from the back, and he'll pop it in such a way that his feet don't move, but he'll end up out over the top of his left leg. So it's like he's doing something that you wouldn't really coach someone to do from a fundamentals level, but he's doing it at times at which he knows probabilistically he's really safe because of the pattern recognition, and that he's throwing it in such an unorthodox and difficult to time scenario for the opponent that he gets away with it, and he's able to actually land his shot with massive consistency. Like that lead right hand, he pops down the pipe. It's like boom, and he throws that right hand, and he almost throws it like a jab with no wind up. Ends up way out over the front of his left leg, and then he dips out then underneath it. So he dips out underneath their right hand, or he'll fall off balance, and straight away he's into a clinch from there because he's off balance and he's able to shut it down. And it's like, so that's kind of an element of this idea of the way of no way. You know, it's like these are kind of guidelines, but they're not rigid prescriptions on how to do things. They're just things worth keeping in mind.
General principles.
Always keeping in mind general principles that always worth keeping in mind, that the core reality underneath all of it is do what it takes to get the job done.
Yeah. So my example of this, Kieran, is about 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know if I've said this before, maybe off camera, so to speak, or whatever, on different podcasts. I probably have. So if you've heard it before, you can listen again. I went doing some training in the city with a Cuban boxing guy for about maybe 6 months when I was taking a break from some running. And it was never intention it was just to do something fun for a few weeks, 1 or 2 training sessions a week. And within the first few weeks I went there, because I did karate growing up, I have this very weird style, nearly like McGregor, where I bounce in and out, that classic kind of karate jumping in and out, or like Machida. And so we were doing these, in these little kind of squares where you would like just touch spar and try and hit the body. And I was like, don't fucking hit me head. Like I'm brain dead enough. I don't want to hit in the head. And they were like, okay, cool. And eventually then the guy that I was sparring with said to me, you need to stop moving. I said, why? He goes, because I can't hit you. I said, not the fucking purpose. Why do I want to get hit by you? Well, you're not really doing the proper boxing footwork. He says, you're just kind of bouncing in and out like a karate guy, and I can't get to you. I went, well, that's your problem to solve, not mine. Yeah, but that's not correct. I said, mate, I'm here for a bit of fitness. I'm not here to be a boxer. And the coach used to say to me as well, what are you jumping around for there like a karate guy? But I'd be in and out, and sometimes I would do the ordinary footwork, but then when it would start getting a bit spicy, to use your words, I would kind of start bouncing back out. But because I had such a good sort of aerobic capacity from coming off the back or running like 100k runs, I could maintain that. That was no bother to me to maintain that for like an hour of training. But it was very unorthodox, and it would annoy people. And it was very interesting because they were dialed into this specific Cuban boxing style, which is very defensive and lots of movement. But I wasn't moving in their similar way. So it would annoy people. But then some guys used to just fucking light me up as well. They'd be like, all right, I can see where he's going to go. I had predictable angles probably. And they would just corner me, especially in the ring. And I'd be lit up then straight away. Or the coach was only a small lad, and he would hit me in the liver a couple of times, and I dropped to my knees. So it can't be shut down. But what I'm trying to say is that, again, you get the job done, you do unorthodox things, and like you're saying, general principles, but people can change and do different things as well. It's like when people say, oh, what's the best thing to do if you get into a fight, Ian? I'm like, fucking run away. Like, that's the best thing you can do. That's the first line of self-defense, is get out of there. This idea that you got to sit there or stand there and beat like 10 guys with one hand like Steven Seagal, that's not reality. I don't care how good you are as a martial artist. The reality is, if you get hit on the street, and especially if there's more than one person, your chances are gone. Weapons involved. Your chances of success are gone right down. So this idea that you can kind of, oh yeah, I did Wing Chun or karate, so I can take on 10 people because of a movie, doesn't work like that, lads.
You're looking at big fucking problems as soon as it's getting. You don't the unpredictability, mates. You don't know if this fella has fucking friends and are gonna come up behind. You don't know what's going on. Get the fuck out of there.
Exactly.
Worst case scenario is you have to actually have a go, but that's the worst case, last case scenario.
Yeah.
Fuck that.
Any closing comments, Kieran, on our first 4 pages of this book or this chapter?
Funnily enough, I actually have, I just opened it on a page where so this is my Kaufman interpretation. So it's not just a translation, it's an interpretation as well.
So you just open on a random page. Right. So let's have this. This will be a new section in the podcast. It's that time of the episode where we go to Random Page with Kieran. In today's Random Page with Kieran, Kieran's going to talk about a random page.
So I'm going to skip a little bit here, right? Because it actually, these 2 lines, these 2 sections actually perfectly map onto what we were just chatting. And this isn't necessarily a random page. It's the page that I had open to read a different quote from. And then on the other side of the page, it's actually a quote that's perfectly relevant to this. So it says, nothing fancy is involved. You go straight to the heart of the matter and defeat the enemy. There is nothing else involved. You either do it or you don't. There is only one purpose in attacking the enemy, to cut him down with finality. But then, a few lines later, I'll skip. And then he goes, the ultimate aim of the martial arts is not having to use them. And that's only within a few lines of each other. So that's exactly, I think that kind of sums up what we talked about today.
That's great, man. That's absolutely perfect. Let's leave it there for the water scroll part 1. After 3 to 4 pages, this is probably the biggest chapter of the book. This could be a long breakdown.
And we'll pick up the next time on, I think the next section is understanding the nature of the long sword, or the way of the long sword, is how they're the 2 different ways that I have it labeled here. I think that's the next section that we're due to pick up on.
All right. If you're listening to this on a podcast, you can fast forward there to the next episode. See you in a minute.